The grandfather clock in the drawing room of the Pendelton estate ticked, a heavy, hollow sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. Outside, the first winter snow had begun to fall, dusting the tall, arched windows in a blinding white. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Evelyn Thorne stood at the makeshift altar, her breath shallow. Wild earth. She was wearing the Pendelton family heirloom, a vintage ivory lace wedding gown that had been passed down to for 4 generations. It fit her perfectly, wrapping around her slender frame like a promise of a future she had worked entirely too hard to earn. But right now, the heavy lace felt like a cage. "I cannot do this," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but in the dead quiet of the room, it rang out like a gunshot. Arthur Pendelton looked at Evelyn, his square jaw tight, but his deep, set gray eyes were empty. He took a step back, pulling his hand out of hers. The warmth of his skin vanished, replaced by the drafty chill of the old manor. "Arthur." Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling just barely. Her fingers, still hovering in the empty air, felt numb. "We are in the middle of our vows." He did not answer her. Instead, his gaze shifted past her shoulder, looking toward the back of the room. Evelyn turned. The sea of wealthy, elite guests parted in absolute silence. Walking down the center aisle was not a latecomer, but a replacement. Victoria Vance wore a crimson-red designer dress that screamed of new money and ruthless ambition. A single strand of flawless pearls rested against her collarbone. She walked with a slow, deliberate arrogance, her sharp, narrow face curled into a smug smile. She did not look like a guest, Earth. She looked like a conqueror stepping into her newly acquired territory. Arthur swallowed hard, his posture crumbling slightly under the weight of his own cowardice. He smoothed the edges of his tweed suit, refusing to meet Evelyn's eyes. "The estate is bankrupt, Evelyn," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough for the front rows to hear. "The Pendelton name is drowning in debt. Victoria's father, he purchased the loans. He is offering a bailout, but only if our families merge. I have no choice. I have to marry her to save my home." Evelyn's chest tightened as the words struck her. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had supported when his family's wealth was nothing but a hollow facade. "You are abandoning me at the altar for a bailout?" she asked. Her voice dangerously quiet. She did not scream. She did not cry. The sheer absurdity of the betrayal paralyzed her vocal cords. Victoria stopped beside Arthur, slipping her arm through his with an air of absolute ownership. She looked Evelyn up and down, her ice blue eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "It is nothing personal, Evelyn. It is just business. You were a charity case Arthur entertained when he thought he had the luxury of time. Now he needs a wife of actual value." A low murmur rippled through the guests. Earth, the people who had smiled at Evelyn 10 minutes ago, were now staring at her with cold, mocking pity. "No," Victoria continued, her tone sharpening into a command. "Take it off." Evelyn froze. "The dress," Victoria said, pointing a manicured finger at the vintage lace. "Earth, that gown belongs to the women of the Pendelton family. It is a historical asset. You are no longer marrying into this family, which means you have absolutely no right to wear it. Take it off now." Evelyn looked at Arthur, waiting for him to defend her, to stop this madness. But Arthur simply looked at the floor. "Please, Evelyn," he whispered pathetically. "Just give it back. Do not make a scene." A sharp pain pierced Evelyn's chest, visceral and cold. The humiliation was absolute, designed not just to reject her, but to break her dignity in front of the entire social elite. She did not beg. She did not fall to her knees. Earth. Her dark, expressive eyes hardened into something unreadable. Two maids, acting on a sharp nod from Victoria, stepped forward. Evelyn did not fight them. She stood perfectly still, her spine straightening, as the maids hastily unbuttoned the delicate pearl buttons running down her back. The rough handling scratched her shoulder, leaving a faint, bleeding mark on her pale skin. The heavy ivory gown fell to the marble floor with a soft thud. Evelyn was left standing in the center of the grand drawing room in nothing but a simple, thin white silk slip. The cold draft of the manor bit into her bare skin, but she did not shiver. The guests gasped, some turning their heads away in mock offense, others whispering cruel jokes behind their champagne glasses. "Show her the door," Victoria ordered, waving her hand dismissively. Security guards stepped forward, grabbing Evelyn by the arms and dragging her down the long hallway. She did not struggle. Her bare feet slapped against the freezing stone floor. As she was shoved toward the grand entrance, she reached into the small pocket of her discarded coat hanging near the door and grabbed the only thing that was truly hers, a heavy antique brass key. Arthur had given it to her the night before, calling it the master key to their forever home. The heavy wooden doors were thrown open. The guards shoved her out onto the grand stone steps. Evelyn stumbled, her bare knees hitting the icy ground as the heavy iron gates of the Pendelton estate began to close mechanically. The loud clang of the metal shutting echoed through the winter air, finalizing her expulsion. She knelt in the deep snow, the freezing wetness seeping through her thin silk slip. The wind howled, biting at the bleeding scratch on her shoulder. Looking up through the iron bars, she could see the warm golden light spilling from the arched windows of the drawing room. They were celebrating her destruction. Evelyn slowly rose to her feet. Her hands were numb, trembling violently from the cold, but she pressed her fingers together, feeling the cold metal of the brass key digging into her palm until her skin almost broke. She did not cry. The tears that threatened to fall simply froze in the corners of her eyes. She looked at the grand estate one last time. The pain in her chest was slowly hardening, turning from shattered love into a devastating, expensive stillness. She turned her back to the iron gates and began to walk away into the snow. The snow was entirely unforgiving. It clung to Evelyn's bare arms and froze against the thin white silk of her slip. Every step she took away from the heavy iron gates of the Pendelton estate felt like walking on broken glass. Her bare feet left shallow, dark footprints in the pristine white snow, quickly erased by the howling winter wind. She walked for what felt like hours. The faint bleeding scratch on her shoulder, courtesy of Victoria's maids, stung sharply in the frigid air, a physical reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. Her teeth chattered violently, her lips turning a bruised shade of violet. Cars drove past her on the distant highway, their headlights slicing through the dark, but she did not wave them down. She did not want anyone's pity. She had spent the last 5 years accepting scraps of affection from a man who had discarded her for a balance sheet. Evelyn stopped under the flickering light of a street lamp. She opened her trembling, frost-bitten hand. Resting on her raw palm was the heavy, antique brass key, the master key to the Pendelton estate. Arthur had given it to her with a smile, a hollow promise of forever. She stared at the cold metal. A single tear escaped her eye, freezing almost instantly against her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her numb hand. That was the last tear Evelyn Thorne would ever shed for Arthur Pendelton. In the brutal cold of that winter night, A fundamental truth solidified in her mindy tears did not buy a roof. Love did not protect you from the storm. Only power did. Only ownership. She closed her fist around the brass key, the sharp edges pressing into her skin, and kept walking into the dark. Time is not a natural healer. It is a meticulous architect. It took 7 years for the shivering girl in the snow to disappear completely. The rain lashed against the floor to ceiling windows of a high-rise office in downtown Manhattan. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and neon red beneath the glass. Standing by the window was a woman who commanded the room with an expensive, terrifying stillness. Evelyn Thorne was now 35. The fragility that once defined her posture had been entirely replaced by a rigid, elegant authority. She wore a tailored colored cashmere coat draped flawlessly over her shoulders, paired with a sleek black turtleneck. The high collar of the dark fabric purposely concealed a faint, thin white scar on her shoulder, the only lingering ghost of a winter night long past. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate low bun. She did not look like a victim. She looked like the apex predator of the real estate market. Over the past 7 years, Evelyn had traded her youth, her sleep, and her capacity for warmth to build an empire out of distressed properties. She bought the debts of the desperate, restructured them with surgical precision, and multiplied her capital until she no longer asked for a seat at the table. She owned the building. The heavy oak door of her office clicked open. Her senior acquisitions manager, David, stepped inside holding a thick, crimson red file. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, intimidated by the absolute silence she projected. M's Thorne. David began, his voice highly professional. I have the portfolio you asked for. The distressed legacy assets the central banks are looking to offload quietly. Evelyn turned away from the window. Earth. Her dark, expressive eyes were unreadable as she walked over to her polished mahogany desk. Resting right in the center of the clean surface, entirely out of place among the sleek modern tech, was an old, tarnished brass key. Tell me about the worst one, Evelyn said. Her voice was smooth, quiet, and devoid of any unnecessary emotion. David opened the red foreclosure notice file. It is a massive estate upstate. Hundreds of acres, a historic manor, Earth. The current owners are drowning in a spectacular amount of toxic debt, Earth. The heir, a man named Arthur Pendelton, made a series of catastrophic investments trying to keep up appearances. But the real hemorrhage is his wife, Victoria. She has been liquidating the state's trust funds to finance a lifestyle they haven't been able to afford for 5 years. They have mortgaged the property 3 times over. The banks are done. They are preparing to foreclose. Evelyn's fingers, perfectly manicured and completely steady, reached out and touched the edge of the brass key. The metal was no longer freezing. It was warm from the ambient heat of her penthouse office. They are looking for a buyer for the debt. David continued, misinterpreting her silence. But it is a hostile acquisition. The Pendeltons are notoriously proud. They will fight the foreclosure in court. Most investors do not want the headache of evicting old money. Evelyn picked up the brass key. She tapped it once, a sharp, metallic click against the polished mahogany wood. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. I am not most investors, Evelyn said quietly. She looked down at the red file. The name Arthur Pendelton was typed in stark black ink across the foreclosure notice. A phantom chill brushed against her collarbone. But her heart rate did not spike. There was no fiery rage, no dramatic gasps of vengeance. There was only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a predator watching the trap finally snap shut. "Buy it," Evelyn instructed, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, chilling the air in the room. "Ems, Thorne, the total debt is astronomical. If we buy it all." I said, "Buy it." She repeated, her gaze rising to meet David's, forcing him into immediate submission. "Wrote the capital through 3 offshore shell companies. I want absolute anonymity. I do not want the banks holding a single cent of their mortgages. I want to own every piece of paper with the Pendelton signature on it. I will become their sole creditor." David nodded quickly, closing the red file. "Understood. The ghost company will hold the rights. They will not know who holds their leash until you pull it." "Exactly," Evelyn murmured, as David hurried out of the office to execute the transfer. Evelyn walked back to the glass window. The rain continued to pour, washing the city clean. She looked down at the antique brass key in her hand. 7 years ago, she had been thrown out of the gates because she had no value. Now, she just bought the ground those gates were built on. The Pendelton estate was a masterclass in the illusion of wealth. To the untrained eye, the towering stone manor with its sprawling manicured lawns and imposing iron gates still looked like the fortress of old money it had been a century ago. But inside, the rot was undeniable. The grand drawing room, where Evelyn had once been stripped of her dignity, smelled faintly of damp wood and despair. The velvet drapes were severely faded. Several original oil paintings had been quietly removed from the mahogany walls and sold to private collectors, leaving lighter, rectangular ghosts on the dark floral wallpaper. Arthur Pendelton sat in his dimly lit study, his elbows resting heavily on a cluttered oak desk. He was 38, but the crushing weight of financial ruin made him look a decade older. His square, heavy-set face was pale, his prominent chin shadowed by a poorly trimmed beard. He was wearing his signature tweed suit, but the cuffs were visibly frayed at edges, a pathetic testament to a man trying to cling to an aristocratic status he could no longer afford. The heavy double doors of the study swung open without a knock. Victoria Vance, now Victoria Pendelton, strode in. Her narrow, angular face was pulled tight with irritation. She wore a tailored ivory blouse, and her signature diamond and pearl bracelet, which clinked sharply against her wrist. The pearls were one of the few pieces she had refused to pawn, insisting they were absolutely vital to maintaining her social standing. "Arthur, the catering company for the winter gala is demanding their deposit." Victoria snapped, crossing her arms. "They refused my credit card." Again. "Fix it." Arthur rubbed his face in exhaustion, not looking up from the mountain of past due notices covering his desk. "There is nothing to fix, Victoria. The accounts are completely empty. The trust fund is gone. We cannot afford to host a charity gala." Victoria's ice blue eyes flashed with venom. She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a condescending hiss. "We're hosting that gala. If high society finds out we are broke, we are socially dead earth. I did not marry into this crumbling mausoleum to be embarrassed in front of my friends." "My father bailed you out 7 years ago!" "And you spent his money in 5! Arthur finally yelled, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. He slammed his fist onto the oak desk. "The trips to Milan? The endless renovations? The private jets? The money is gone, Victoria. My father's legacy is gone. We are drowning, and you are worried about Horace do-overs?" Victoria sneered, completely unmoved by his panic. "You are pathetic. You were pathetic when you threw out that little charity case at the altar to get to my money, and you are Pathetic now. Find the cash, Arthur. Or I will find a husband who can. She turned on her heel and marched out of the room, slamming the doors behind her. Earth. The harsh sound echoed through the vast, empty manor. Arthur sank back into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. He was a hollow king ruling over a bankrupt castle. A sharp knock at the side entrance interrupted his misery. It was the head butler, looking deeply uncomfortable, holding a silver tray. On the tray sat a thick, stiff red envelope, delivered by certified courier. From a legal firm in Manhattan, sir, the butler said quietly, keeping his eyes politely averted. It requires your immediate signature. Arthur took the envelope. His hands, usually so steady when holding a crystal glass of scotch, were trembling slightly. He sliced the thick paper open with a brass letter opener. He pulled out the documents. The bold black letters at the top of the page made the blood drain entirely from his face. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He read through the dense legal jargon, his eyes darting frantically across the page. He had known the banks were losing patience, but this was entirely different. The banks had not initiated the foreclosure. They had sold the debt. All three of the estate's mortgages, along with his unsecured personal loans, had been consolidated and purchased by a single, anonymous holding company, Vanguard Zenith Holdings. No. Arthur whispered, panic rising in his chest like bile. No, they cannot do this. A single creditor. When you owed a bank, you were a number. You could delay, you could negotiate, you could plead for an extension based on public relations. But owing a single private entity meant he was at the absolute mercy of whoever owned Vanguard Zenith. They held the total, undeniable right to evict him. The deadline for full repayment or immediate seizure of the property was exactly 30 days. Arthur scrambled for his phone, his heavy fingers slipping on the glass screen. He dialed the number for his attorney.
They sold the debt.
He shouted the second the call connected. Find out who owns Vanguard Zenith. Call them. Offer them higher interest. Earth. Offer them a partial liquidation of the Southern Eckridge.
Just get them to stop the foreclosure.
For the next 48 hours, Arthur barely slept. He sat in his dark study, typing frantic, pathetic emails to the legal representatives of the Faceless Creditor. He wrote about the historical significance of the Pendelton estate. He begged for a meeting. He pleaded for a human conversation, using the pride of his family name as a shield that no longer held any weight. Every single email was met with the exact same automated, chillingly polite response. The creditor declines all requests for negotiation. Prepare for asset forfeiture. Arthur stared at the glowing screen of his laptop in the dark, the frayed cuffs of his tweed suit resting on the mahogany desk. The arrogance that had fueled him 7 years ago had completely evaporated. He was a terrified, desperate man screaming into a void, completely unaware that the silence echoing back at him belonged to the woman he had left to freeze in the snow. The corporate offices of Vanguard Zenith Holdings sat on the 60th floor of a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the financial district. It was a cathedral of modern wealth. The floors were polished white marble, the walls lined with minimalist modern art, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cedar and ozone. Arthur Pendelton looked entirely out of place. He had taken a train into the city through a brutal winter downpour. His signature tweed suit was soaked through, the heavy wool smelling of damp earth and desperation. Rainwater dripped from his graying hair onto the immaculate marble floor. Earth. His hands gripping a saturated leather briefcase were shaking violently as he stood before the pristine reception desk. Earth, I have been calling for 3 days, Arthur said, his voice straining to maintain the authoritative timbre. Old money. I demand to speak to the managing director or the principal investor, whoever is handling the Pendelton estate file. The receptionist, a young man in a flawless navy suit, barely blinked.
I am sorry.
Pendelton. The principal does not take unscheduled meetings. In fact, the principal does not take meetings regarding foreclosures at all.
This is not a standard foreclosure.
Arthur's voice cracked, echoing sharply across the quiet lobby. He slammed his hand flat against the sleek marble counter.
This is a historic property.
You cannot simply seize a century of legacy through automated emails. I just need 5 minutes with them, please. A set of double glass doors slid open, and David, the senior acquisitions manager, stepped into the lobby. He adjusted his glasses, looking at the drenched, frantic hair with a practiced, clinical detachment. Pendelton, David said smoothly. Earth, I am the senior legal proxy for Vanguard Zenith. You are making a scene that will not help your case. The terms of the debt transfer are absolute. You have 27 days to vacate the premises. Arthur turned to David, his chest heaving. The sheer panic in his deep, set gray eyes stripped away decades of aristocratic arrogance. I can liquidate the southern acreage. I can offer 30% interest yield on an extended payment plan. My wife's family has connections in London. We can secure bridging capital by the end of the fiscal quarter. Just tell the owner to give me a chance to explain. Just behind David was a massive wall of frosted, smart glass dividing the lobby from the executive suites. The glass was entirely opaque to Arthur. He could not see the spacious, dimly lit office on the other side. He could not see the heavy mahogany desk. And he certainly could not see Evelyn Thorne sitting behind it. Evelyn was perfectly still, draped in her camel-colored cashmere coat, the high black turtleneck framing her sharp, unreadable face. Her dark eyes were fixed on the frosted glass. Through the internal security monitors on her desk, she had a crystal clear, high-definition view of Arthur unraveling in the lobby. The intercom system fed his panicked, cracking voice directly into her office. She picked up the antique brass key from her desk, rolling the heavy, cold metal slowly between her manicured fingers. 7 years ago, this man had stood at a makeshift altar and confidently declared that she was a liability. He had watched her stripped to her slip in the freezing snow because saving his precious manor was worth destroying a human being. And now here he was shivering and begging a pane of frosted glass, offering to sell off pieces of that exact same manor just to survive another month. Please, Arthur begged, leaning heavily against the reception desk, his knees visibly buckling. You do not understand, Earth. If we lose the estate, my family loses everything. We have nowhere to go. My wife, she will not survive the scandal. We will be ruined. Tell the principal that I am begging them. Tell them I will do whatever they ask. Evelyn listened to the raw desperation in his voice. She searched her own chest for a flicker of pity, a ghost of the love she had once held for him. There was absolutely nothing. The realization brought her a deep, expensive peace. His apology, his begging, his tears, none of it was for her. He was mourning bricks and mortar. He was mourning his status. David's voice filtered through the speaker, crisp and merciless. The principal is fully aware of your situation. Mixed Pendelton. The principal simply does not care. The property will be seized. Evelyn set the brass key down. She reached for her pen and pulled the final authorization file toward her. It was in order to freeze Arthur's remaining liquid checking accounts, effectively cutting off his ability to hire defense counsel or delay the eviction. She signed her name with fluid, steady strokes. Before she stood up, Evelyn reached toward the intercom console on her desk. She did not press the button to speak. Instead, she picked up the antique brass key. She held the microphone button down for exactly 1 second and brought the heavy metal key down against the edge of the mahogany desk. Click. The sharp, metallic sound broadcasted instantly into the lobby speakers. It was crisp, heavy, and undeniably deliberate. On the screen, Arthur froze. He stopped breathing. His head jerked toward the frosted glass wall, his eyes wide. That specific, heavy click of brass hitting wood. It was a sound he had heard before, a long time ago, echoing in the grand halls of his home. A violent shiver ran down his spine, a primal instinct warning him of a predator in the shadows. Who is back there? Arthur whispered, his voice trembling anew. Evelyn released the intercom button. She did not look back at the monitor. She picked up the red foreclosure file, turned on her heel, and walked out through her private elevator, leaving the ruined hair staring blindly at a wall of frosted glass. The Crystal Winter Gala was the undisputed pinnacle of the city's high society calendar. Held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the event was a glittering ocean of diamond chandeliers, overflowing champagne towers, and the most ruthless, observant socialites on the eastern seaboard. To not attend was to admit defeat. To attend without money was a suicide mission. Earth, Victoria Pendelton, navigated the crowded ballroom like a soldier walking through a minefield. She wore a dramatic crimson silk gown that she had bought 3 seasons ago, praying no one would notice it was a repeat. Her signature diamond and pearl bracelet felt heavy against her wrist, the only piece of genuine wealth she had left. Her narrow, angular face was set in a rigid, forced smile. Arthur walked half a step behind her. His tailored tuxedo hung loosely on his frame, his broad shoulders slouching under the invisible, crushing weight of the frozen bank accounts. Every clink of crystal, every burst of polite laughter sounded like a mockery to his ears. He kept looking over his shoulder, haunted by the metallic click he had heard through the intercom the day before. Stand up straight, Arthur. Victoria hissed through her teeth, not breaking her painted smile as she waved at a distant Heiress. You look like a corpse. We need to secure an invitation to the Sterling yacht party tonight. If they smell blood in the water, we are finished. They approached the silent auction tables lining the edge of the ballroom. Earth. Victoria, determined to prove their financial invincibility, picked up a gold-plated pen. She signed her name on the bid sheet for a vintage emerald necklace, writing down a figure that was twice the current limit on their liquidated checking accounts. Arthur grabbed her elbow, his gray eyes wide with panic. Are you insane? Vanguard Zenith froze the accounts yesterday. Earth. We do not have $10,000, let alone 100,000. Shut up, she snapped, jerking her arm away. It is a silent auction. The funds are not processed until tomorrow, Earth. By then, I will have convinced my father to wire us an emergency bridge loan. It is about appearances, Arthur. But the illusion did not even last 5 minutes. Before Victoria could set the pen down, the Gala's financial director, a sharp-eyed woman holding an iPad, stepped out from behind the velvet ropes, flanked by a discreet security guard. Ms. Pendelton, the director said, her voice carrying an excruciatingly polite volume that guaranteed the surrounding guests could hear. I apologize for the interruption, but our banking system has automatically rejected your pre-authorization. It appears a hard legal freeze has been placed on all assets under the Pendelton name. The chatter at the adjacent tables died instantly. Several guests turned, their eyes dropping to the rejected bid sheet, and then up to Victoria's face. Victoria's tan skin drained of all color. Her hand flew to her pearl bracelet, her fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. There must be a mistake, she stammered, her voice shrill, entirely losing its aristocratic polish. Run the card again. My family is... The card was declined. Mom? The security guard interrupted, his tone devoid of respect. I must ask you to step away from the bidding tables. A low, cruel whisper rippled through the crowd. The social elite were brutal. They forgave cruelty. They forgave affairs, but they never forgave poverty. Victoria stood completely frozen, stripped of her armor in front of the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. Arthur could not breathe. The walls of the grand ballroom were closing in. He let go of Victoria's arm, abandoning her to the stares of the vultures, and pushed his way through the crowd. And he needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating reality of his own ruin, Earth. He burst through a set of heavy glass doors leading out onto the ballroom's sprawling terrace. The freezing winter wind hit him instantly, chilling the sweat on his forehead. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the stone balcony in a quiet, undisturbed white earth. Arthur gripped the stone railing, gasping for air, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. Then he realized he was not alone. Standing at the far end of the terrace, partially obscured by the shadows, was a woman. She was not shivering. She stood with an expensive, terrifying stillness, looking out over the city lights. A camel-colored cashmere coat was draped elegantly over her shoulders, protecting a sleek, pitched, black turtleneck. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate low bun. Arthur froze. The biting wind carried a scent to him. Faint but unmistakable, it was crisp winter air mixed with something warm, something he had not smelled in 7 years. He took a hesitant step forward. The snow crunched beneath his polished leather shoes. "Excuse me?" He breathed, his voice trembling. The woman did not turn around. She was holding a crystal champagne flute in her right hand. Slowly, deliberately, she tapped her index finger against the rim of the glass. Clink. Clink. It was the exact cadence of the brass key hitting the mahogany desk. Arthur's blood ran ice cold. His jaw went slack, his knees feeling suddenly weak. Evelyn. He whispered into the dark, the name feeling like ash on his tongue. Before the woman could turn her head, the glass doors opened behind Arthur. David, the senior acquisitions manager from Vanguard Zenith, stepped out onto the snowy terrace. "Ems Thorne?" David said respectfully, ignoring Arthur entirely. "The Vanguard Zenith executive table is ready for you inside." The woman lowered her champagne glass. She turned her head just a fraction of an inch, enough for the chandelier light from the window to catch her sharp, unreadable, dark eyes. She looked at Arthur Pendelton, a man shivering and broken in the snow, with the absolute indifference of a queen regarding a peasant. She did not say a single word. She simply turned her back, walking past David and stepping back into the light of the ballroom. Arthur was left standing alone in the freezing dark, the snow accumulating on his shoulders, his world entirely shattered. The faceless predator, holding the noose around his neck, had a name, and it was the bride he had thrown away. The morning of the final foreclosure arrived with a bitter, bone chilling frost. Inside the grand drawing room of the Pendelton estate, the massive stone fireplace sat empty and cold. The faded velvet drapes were pulled wide open, letting in a gray, unforgiving winter light that exposed every scratch on the antique wood and every worn patch on the Persian rug. Earth. Arthur Pendelton sat heavily on the edge of a worn red leather sofa, his head buried in his hands. He wore his frayed tweed suit, his face haggard, his eyes bloodshot from a week without sleep. Pacing frantically across the room was Victoria. She was dressed defensively in a sharp, black silk blouse, her signature pearl bracelet clicking sharply against her wrist with every rigid step she took. Standing quietly near the grand arched doorway was Sheriff Miller. His arms were folded, a heavy metal clipboard resting against his chest. He was simply waiting for the authorized representative of Vanguard Zenith Holdings to arrive, sign the final seizure documents, and officially transfer the property. Arthur stopped shaking. Victoria snapped, though her own voice vibrated with thinly veiled panic. When this principal investor arrives, you will sit up straight and let me do the talking. Earth. These corporate types always want to bridge into high society. I will offer them an exclusive honorary seat on the Sterling Charity Board in exchange for a 90-day extension. We are not losing this house to a bank. Arthur slowly lifted his head, his deep, set gray eyes entirely vacant. You do not understand, Victoria. It is not a corporate type. I saw her at the gala. On the balcony, saw who... Stop talking in pathetic riddles. Victoria hissed, her patience entirely evaporated. Before Arthur could explain the ghost he had seen in the snow, the heavy mahogany double doors of the drawing room groaned. Opening with a slow, deliberate weight, Sheriff Miller straightened his posture. Victoria adjusted her shoulders, pasting on her most aristocratic, condescending smile, ready to negotiate her survival. Evelyn Thorne stepped over the threshold. She did not rush. She walked with an excruciatingly slow, measured grace, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble entryway before stepping onto the Persian rug. The tailored camel-colored cashmere coat draped over her shoulders swayed slightly, revealing the immaculate black turtleneck beneath. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a severe, perfect low bun. In her gloved hand, she held the thick, crimson-red foreclosure file. Victoria's polite smile froze, then violently shattered. Her ice blue eyes widened in absolute disbelief. Evelyn, what is the meaning of this? Who let you pass the gates? She turned sharply, glaring at the sheriff. Remove her. This is a private residence, and we are expecting the principal
Of Vanguard Zenith.
Ma'am, Sheriff Miller said quietly, his face entirely impassive as he looked at his clipboard. This is Ms. Thorne. She is the principal of Vanguard Zenith. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum that sucked all the oxygen from the massive drawing room. Earth. Victoria's jaw dropped, her sharp features twisting in a desperate, frantic attempt to process the impossible. No, that is absurd. She was a nobody. She is a glorified secretary.
Arthur, tell them.
Arthur did not speak. He could not. He slowly rose from the red leather sofa, his knees trembling so violently he had to grip the carved wooden armrest just to stay upright. He stared at Evelyn, the crushing reality of his doom settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The woman he had discarded to save his money now possessed all of it. Evelyn walked to the exact center of the drawing room. She stopped on the precise spot where 7 years ago Victoria's maids had unbuttoned her vintage lace gown and stripped her down to her slip. She looked around the room, taking in the faded wallpaper, the missing oil paintings, and the cold fireplace. Her dark, unreadable eyes finally rested on Victoria and then slowly moved to Arthur. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she tossed the thick red file onto the antique mahogany coffee table. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. The deadline was midnight, Evelyn said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of anger or vindication. It was the crisp, professional voice of an owner addressing a trespasser. The debt is in default. The transfer of the deed is complete. Victoria lunged forward, her voice pitching into an ugly, shrill scream.
You planned this! You stalked us!
You obsessed over us because Arthur threw you out like the trash. You were! You think you can just buy your way into my family's estate? Evelyn did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Victoria with a slow, chilling blink. Your family's estate, Evelyn repeated softly. She reached into the pocket of her cashmere coat and pulled out the antique brass key. She held it up by her fingertips, the dull metal catching the gray winter light. You have not owned this estate for 5 years, Victoria. The banks owned it, and now I own the banks. You are currently standing in my living room. Arthur let out a ragged, pathetic sound, something caught between a sob and a gasp. He collapsed. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, entirely broken. The fragile illusion of his aristocratic superiority crumbled into dust. He looked up at Evelyn, his trembling hands reaching out toward the hem of her cashmere coat, though he dared not touch it. Evelyn, Arthur wept, hot tears finally spilling over his sunken, unshaven cheeks. Evelyn, please.
I am sorry.
I was a coward. I was a fool. Please, you cannot take my home. Evelyn looked down at the man kneeling at her feet. The vast room that had once echoed with their cruelty and mockery was now filled entirely with his pathetic weeping. The reversal of power was absolute. Are you out of your mind? Victoria's voice shattered the heavy silence of the drawing room. She was not yelling at Evelyn. She was staring down at Arthur, who was still kneeling on the faded Persian rug, weeping into his trembling hands. The disgust in Victoria's ice blue eyes was absolute, sharp enough to cut bone. Get up. Victoria shrieked, kicking the edge of Arthur's frayed tweed trousers with her designer heel.
Do not grovel before her. You are a Pendelton.
Arthur did not move. He was completely broken, hyperventilating as the reality of his total financial ruin crushed whatever was left of his pride. Victoria looked around the room, her chest heaving under her black silk blouse. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The estate was gone. The money was gone. The social standing she had fought so viciously to maintain was entirely evaporated. She had married into a legacy, and now she was shackled to a bankrupt ghost. I am not going down with you, Victoria hissed, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper. She gripped her diamond and pearl bracelet, ensuring the only valuable thing left in the room was firmly secured to her wrist. I gave you my father's money. I gave you my youth, and you lost it all to a glorified secretary. You are a spineless, pathetic loser. She turned her back on her husband, without another glance at Evelyn or the sheriff. Victoria marched out of the grand drawing room. The rapid, sharp clicking of her heels echoed down the marble hallway, followed by the heavy slam of the front door. She was gone, abandoning the sinking ship without a second thought. Arthur remained on his knees. He looked up, his face slick with tears, his deep-set gray eyes red and swollen. Slowly, a horrifyingly desperate shift occurred in his expression. The panic began to recede, replaced by a sudden, feverish delusion. He crawled an inch forward, looking up at Evelyn. You bought the debt. He breathed, a trembling, pathetic smile forming on his lips. The banks were going to tear the estate down. They were going to sell it to developers. But you bought it. You saved my home. Evelyn stared at him. She did not blink. She stood perfectly still in her camel-colored cashmere coat, watching the sheer madness of his rationalization unfold. You came back for me. Arthur wept, his voice taking on a sickeningly hopeful tone. He reached out, his shaking fingers stopping just an inch from the hem of her coat, too afraid of the sheriff to actually touch her. I know. I was a coward, Evelyn. I was so young. My mother, the debt, the pressure. They forced me to choose the money, but I never stopped loving you. Every day with Victoria was a nightmare, but you did this to save us. We can fix this. Victoria is gone. We can be together right here, exactly like we planned, Sheriff Miller. Evelyn said quietly, not taking her eyes off the man on the floor. Would you give us 2 minutes? Please wait in the hall. The sheriff nodded respectfully. He stepped backward, pulling the heavy mahogany doors partially shut, leaving them alone. Evelyn looked down at Arthur. The absolute stillness in her posture was suffocating. She did not scream. She did not laugh at his absurdity. The total absence of emotion in her dark eyes was far more terrifying than any rage could ever be. Do not project your pathetic romantic delusions onto my financial acquisitions, Arthur. Evelyn said, her voice smooth and lethally cold. Arthur's hopeful smile faltered. Evelyn, please. 7 years ago, Evelyn interrupted, her tone lowering, commanding total silence. You stood exactly where I am standing now. You looked me in the eye and told me that I was a liability. You watched your new bride strip me down to my slip, and you let your guards throw me into a blizzard. Do you remember what the cold feels like, Arthur? Arthur swallowed hard, his face draining of color. I was terrified. I was trying to save the house. You loved this house more than you loved me. Evelyn stating a simple, factual truth. She took a slow, deliberate step back, increasing the distance between her polished leather boots and his knees. You sold your soul, your dignity, and my heart just to keep these 4 walls. You calculated my net worth and found it lacking. So I spent the last 7 years making sure that I could afford to buy the one thing you loved most. She picked up the antique brass key from the coffee table. The metal gleamed in the gray winter light. I did not buy this debt to rescue you, Arthur. I bought it to evict you, Evelyn said, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous room. I bought it so that when you finally lost your legacy, the name on the foreclosure notice would be mine. Arthur sobbed, burying his face in his hands as the last remaining pillar of his delusion violently collapsed. Police, he begged, a broken, hollow sound. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing. You have exactly 30 days, Evelyn said, and entirely unmoved by his tears. 30 days to pack your personal effects and vacate my property. If you are not gone by the end of the month, the sheriff will physically remove you. Anything left behind will be incinerated. She turned her back on him, the heavy fabric of her cashmere coat sweeping elegantly through the air. She walked toward the grand doors, leaving the broken hair, weeping on the floor of a house that no longer belonged to him, Earth. The 30-day eviction window was not a period of transition for Arthur Pendelton. It was a prolonged, excruciating psychological execution. The estate emptied quickly. Earth. Victoria's lawyers had worked with blistering speed, serving Arthur with divorce papers less than 48 hours after she had walked out of the drawing room. She took the remaining silver her designer clothes, and her flawless pearls, abandoning the state to hunt for a more solvent husband in Europe. Arthur was left completely alone in the massive, drafty manor, surrounded by echoes and packed cardboard boxes. But Arthur did not spend those 30 days quietly accepting his fate. He spent them begging. Desperation stripped away the last fragments of his aristocratic pride. He became a man obsessed, consumed by the agonizing realization that the key to his survival was held by the woman he had treated as completely disposable. During the first week, he flooded the legal channels. He sent dozens of emails to Vanguard, Zenith Holdings, addressing them directly to Evelyn. He wrote long, sprawling, pathetic messages filled with memories of their early 20s, reminders of the times they had walked through the estate gardens, promises they had made in the dark. He offered to sign away his entire future income. He offered to work as the estate manager, the groundskeeper, and anything just to be allowed to stay within the stone walls of his ancestral home. Not a single email received a reply. By the second week, the panic became physical. Arthur took the train into Manhattan every single morning. He wore his fraying tweed suit, standing outside the towering glass skyscraper of Vanguard Zenith Holdings in the freezing winter rain. He looked like a madman, his graying hair plastered to his forehead, holding a drenched paper cup of cheap coffee, watching the private executive elevator banks. On a bitter Tuesday afternoon, he finally saw her. Evelyn walked through the grand marble lobby, flanked by David and two massive security contractors. She was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, an oversized black wool coat draped over her shoulders. She looked like untouchable, weaponized wealth. Arthur broke through the velvet ropes, scrambling across the polished marble floor. "Evelyn!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure agony.
Evelyn, please, just look at me.
The security guards moved instantly, intercepting Arthur before he could get within 10 feet of her. They shoved him back, his wet shoes slipping on the marble, sending him crashing to his knees. Evelyn did not break her stride. She did not flinch. She did not even turn her head to acknowledge the man screaming her name on the floor. Her dark, expressive eyes remained fixed straight ahead, perfectly calm, as if he were nothing more than a stray dog barking at a passing train. She stepped into the waiting black SUV outside, the tinted windows rolling up, leaving Arthur kneeling in the lobby, weeping as pedestrians stepped around him in disgust. But Arthur could not stop. The rejection only fueled his pathetic delusion that if he suffered enough, if he humiliated himself enough, she would eventually pity him. In the final week, the financial press caught wind of the story. The absolute collapse of the Pendelton legacy and the aggressive, anonymous takeover by Vanguard Zenith was too juicy to ignore. Paparazzi began to camp outside the estate gates and the corporate offices. Arthur used the cameras as a final, desperate stage. When Evelyn exited a charity dinner at the Plaza Hotel, a dinner he could no longer even dream of attending, Arthur was waiting behind the police barricades. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding strobe of white light.
I was wrong.
Arthur wailed into the cold night air, pressing his face against the metal barricade, reaching his bare, shaking hand toward her through the crowd. "I am sorry.
I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Please, Evelyn, do not take my home."
The cameras captured every agonizing second of his public humiliation. They captured the tears streaming down his haggard, sunken face. And more importantly, they captured Evelyn. She paused on the red carpet. The flashbulbs illuminated her flawless posture, her expensive stillness. For one brief, terrifying second, she looked directly at him. Her gaze was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was the absolute, devastating emptiness of someone looking at a stranger. She turned away, stepping into the warmth of her waiting car. Arthur's apologies were broadcasted across the city, printed in the morning papers, whispered about in the very social circles that had once mocked Evelyn. He had spent years, first in his heart and now in reality, begging for forgiveness from a woman who had long ago decided that his apologies were entirely worthless. The clock ticked down. The 30 days evaporated. Earth. The morning of the final eviction arrived, and Arthur Pendelton had absolutely nothing left to trade. The low, mechanical rumble of diesel engines shattered the centuries old quiet of the Pendelton estate. 3 massive commercial moving trucks were parked haphazardly across the frozen gravel of the grand circular driveway. The heavy mahogany doors of the manor were propped wide open, letting the biting winter wind sweep freely through the empty halls. Men in thick canvas work jackets marched in and out of the house, carrying the skeletal remains of a dying dynasty. They carried out the heavy oak dining chairs, rolled up the massive Persian rugs, and hauled away the worn red leather sofa where Arthur had wept exactly 30 days ago. The echo of packing, tape ripping across cardboard boxes sounded like the final ragged breaths of the estate. Arthur Pendelton stood off to the side near the stone pillars of the entrance. He was a hollowed out shell of a man, the winter air cut right through his signature tweed suit, which was now visibly stained and fraying at the lapels. He did not have an overcoat. He did not have an umbrella to shield him from the light, dusting snow. He simply stood there, his sunken gray eyes watching his heritage being boxed up and loaded into the back of rented trucks. He had nothing left. His bank accounts were empty. His wife was in Europe with another man, and his social standing was completely obliterated. He had spent the last month sacrificing every ounce of his dignity, begging a woman who did not even view him as human anymore. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke through the mechanical noise. A sleek, black SUV pulled through the open iron gates, driving slowly past the moving trucks before coming to a smooth stop near the front steps. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Evelyn Thorne emerged into the freezing air. She was dressed with immaculate, terrifying precision. A tailored black wool coat fell perfectly over a crisp white silk blouse. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into that severe signature bun, defying the winter wind. Earth. She wore fitted black leather gloves, her hands casually resting at her sides. She looked at the towering stone manor, not with the awe of a visitor, but the cold, calculating eye of an owner inspecting an asset. Sheriff Miller, who had been standing by the porch to ensure the eviction proceeded without violence, walked over to her. He held a heavy metal clipboard. The premises are nearly clear, Ms. Thorne, the sheriff said respectfully. The movers are securing the last load. Pendelton's personal effects have been placed in the smallest truck. Per your instructions, the property is legally vacant. Evelyn gave a slow, measured nod.
Thank you, Sheriff.
I want the locks changed within the hour. Arthur watched her. His legs moved before his brain could process the humiliation of it. He stumbled forward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the icy gravel. The sheer proximity to her, the woman who held the absolute power of his ruin, drew him in like a dying man to a flame. Evelyn. Arthur croaked, his voice raw, completely ruined by a month of screaming and crying. Evelyn turned her head, her dark eyes locked onto him. There was no pity. There was no lingering hatred. There was only the expensive stillness of a predator observing a defeated prey. Arthur stopped 3 feet away from her. He looked at her flawless coat, her pristine leather gloves, and then down at his own shivering, pathetic frame. He raised his right hand. His bare fingers were purple from the cold, trembling so violently he could barely hold them straight. He reached out toward her, a desperate, subconscious instinct to touch her, to find some shred of the girl who had once loved him, just to prove he was not completely alone in the world. Pleas, Arthur whispered, a final, breathless plea. As his fingers closed the distance, Evelyn moved. She did not flinch. She did not gasp or step back in fear. She simply shifted her weight, pulling her arm back with a smooth, deliberate motion. Earth. It was a micro expression of profound, absolute disgust. Earth. She looked at his trembling hand as if he were covered in a contagious disease, her upper lip curling just a fraction of an inch. Do not touch me, Evelyn said quietly. The lethal calm in her voice froze the blood in Arthur's veins. You lost the right to stand near me 7 years ago. Arthur let his hand drop to his side, the final blow landing straight against his chest. He closed his eyes, a choked sob escaping his throat. Evelyn turned away from him, completely dismissing his existence. She reached into her coat pocket with her leather gloved hand and pulled out a sleek gold fountain pen. She stepped up to the hood of the nearest moving truck, motioning for Sheriff Miller to present the clipboard. Earth. The cold metal of the truck's hood served as her desk. The document was the final writ of possession. Evelyn uncapped her pen. With fluid, unapologetic strokes, she signed her name across the bottom line. The ink dried instantly in the freezing air. The signature legally erased a century of Pendelton history and transferred the absolute sovereignty of the estate to Evelyn Thorne. She capped the pen and handed the clipboard back to the sheriff. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the antique brass key, gripping it tightly in her gloved hand. Clear the driveway, Evelyn ordered, her voice cutting through the winter wind. The trespasser needs to leave. The low rumble of the moving truck faded down the long, winding road, eventually swallowed entirely by the dense winter forest. As the mechanical noise dissipated, a profound, breathless silence settled over the estate. It was not the hollow, anxious quiet of a bankrupt family waiting for ruin. It was a new, pristine silence. The silence of absolute ownership. Arthur Pendelton was not allowed to walk out on his own terms. 2 of Vanguard Zenith's private security contractors flanked him, their massive frames guiding him down the quarter-mile gravel driveway. Arthur dragged his feet, his polished leather shoes scuffing against the ice. Every step was sheer agony. He looked at the towering oak trees lining the path, trees his grandfather had planted, trees he had played beneath as a child. He was leaving them behind forever. His legacy had been boxed up, driven away, and he was being discarded like unwanted refuse. The winter wind howled, whipping the snow into a blinding flurry. Arthur shivered violently. His frayed tweed suit offered absolutely no protection against the biting cold. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his purple, frostbitten fingers curling into his sleeves to preserve whatever body heat he had left. They reached the towering, wrought iron gates at the edge of the property. The guards did not shove him violently. They simply kept walking forward, an unstoppable wall of muscle, forcing Arthur to step backward until his heels slipped off the manicured gravel and hit the rough, icy asphalt of the public county road. He had crossed the boundary line. Arthur stumbled, his freezing legs giving out. He fell to his knees in the deep snowbank, just outside the entrance. Earth. The shock of the freezing wetness seeping through his trousers sent a violent shudder through his entire body. He looked down at the snow, and then slowly a horrifying realization washed over him. He knew this exact patch of ground. 7 years ago, he had stood in the warmth of his grand drawing room and allowed his guards to drag Evelyn out into a blizzard. She had fallen right here, in this exact spot in the freezing snow, wearing nothing but a thin white slip. Her shoulder bleeding. He had let the gates close on her. He had abandoned her to the storm because he believed she had no value. Now, the universe had aligned with terrifying, poetic symmetry. A slow, rhythmic crunching sound drew his attention back to the driveway. Evelyn Thorne was walking toward the gates. She moved with a fluid, haunting grace. Her tailored black wool coat protected her entirely from the winter chill. The dark fabric absorbed the gray light, making her look like a phantom of retribution. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, completely devoid of pity, anger, or triumph. She was simply inspecting the conclusion of her 7-year investment. She stopped just inside the boundary line, Earth. The towering iron gates stood wide open between them. Arthur looked up at her from the snow. His face was slick with tears and melting ice. His deep, set gray eyes completely hollowed out. He had spent years begging this woman, first in his panicked emails, then on the freezing streets of Manhattan, and finally at her feet. He had offered her apologies, desperate explanations, and his very soul. None of it had mattered. Evelyn, Arthur whispered. His voice was so broken it was barely audible over the wind. What do I do now? Evelyn looked down at him. She did not owe him advice. She did not owe him closure. She reached out with her black leather gloved hands and grabbed the heavy iron bars of the gates. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled the massive iron doors together. They met in the center with a loud, definitive metallic clang that echoed through the bare winter trees. The physical barrier was now complete. She was on the inside, wrapped in wealth, warmth, and untouchable power. He was on the outside, freezing in the dark. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the antique brass key. The exact key Arthur had given her a lifetime ago, the key she had clung to when she was shivering in the snow. She slid the heavy brass key into the ancient iron lock. She turned her wrist. Click. The sound of the deadbolt locking into place was the loudest sound Arthur had ever heard. It was the sound of his total erasure. Evelyn withdrew the key. She looked through the iron bars at the shivering, pathetic man kneeling in the snow. This is my estate now, Evelyn said softly. She did not wait for his response. She turned her back on him and began to walk up the long gravel driveway. She did not look back. Behind her, the massive stone manor suddenly illuminated. Warm, golden light spilled from the arched windows, casting a beautiful, welcoming glow across the snow, welcoming its true master home. Arthur Pendelton remained kneeling in the dark, weeping into his frozen hands, finally understanding that some apologies are simply meant to echo into the void forever.